Welcome to our Thursday Deep Dive webinar, where we focus on a particular topic or issue. I'm Yomika Bennett, Director of New York Charter Schools Association. Today we're thrilled to host a presentation by a team from the Stanford CREDO Institute. We have with us from the Stanford CREDO Institute today, Mackie Raymond, Director of the Institute, Carla Weiss, Research Analyst, and Dan Cristiani, Senior Research Analyst. From SUNY Charter Schools Institute, Susie Corello, Executive Director, Jeff Wasbest, Executive Deputy Director for Accountability, David Frank, Executive Director of the Charter Schools Office at New York Education Department, Aaron Cochran, Managing Director of Policy and Operations at New York City Department of Education. Today's presentation will review the findings of the CREDO team on the work and evolution of charter schools in New York during the first few months of the COVID crisis this spring. Following a short presentation by Dan and Carla, David, Jeff, and Aaron will also share their thoughts, and then we'll field questions during the Q&A. And we'll use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please send your questions through there so everyone can see them. One quick programming note before we get started. If you're interested in participating in the free Google for Education session Monday afternoon, please register using the link that will drop in the chat. Welcome, Dan and Carla. I'll turn it over to you now with many thanks to you and the entire CREDO team for this report and for taking the time to join us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the time. We know it's a busy time of year, so we really appreciate it. I'm going to start sharing a few slides with you. Just note that this is only a partial sampling of slides. The entire deck is available publicly on our website, so that's available to you if you'd like to view it. But Charlotte, I'll share these slides, and you can start us off.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, so as Yomika had mentioned, we are presenting to you today just some high-level descriptive results from a 187-item survey that we fielded in May to better understand how New York charter schools responded to the governor's executive order that closed school buildings due to COVID-19. We want to start first just with a big thank you to the schools for taking the time to thoughtfully respond to this survey. We ended with a 93% response rate, which is representative of the New York charter sector, both across school characteristics and student characteristics. So thank you again very much for your responses. We'll present some key findings today, and then Dan will end with some points for consideration or potential discussion based on these findings. So we'd like to start today just by situating this in the context of the urgency that schools were facing. Yeah, thanks. We had asked schools to rate the urgency of 10 different factors at the point of building closure on a 4-point scale, where 0 indicates they were not at all urgent and 3 indicates they were very urgent. And what you can see from this figure here, as you move rightward on the x-axis, the higher the average urgency that schools were facing. And you see that most schools are represented by that dark blue, where the average urgency that they were facing was closest to the very urgent classification. And you should even see that high stacking of schools at the 3.0 mark, where 75 schools indicated that all factors were very urgent. Now, among the individual factors themselves, it's those related to sustaining student growth. And Dan, you can advance, thanks. So it's those that were related to sustaining student growth that were rated the most urgent across schools, followed closely by keeping the community connected. But it's worth noting here that the average urgency of each factor was above somewhat urgent, which would be a 2, and in most cases closer to very urgent, which would be a 3. So in addition to this urgency that schools were facing, I'm sure all of us are aware that there was very little time for schools to plan and pivot from school building closure to remote instruction, especially given how rapidly the consequences of COVID-19 in the US unfolded. But rather impressively, it took only an average of 3 days from the point of building closure for schools to pivot to some form of remote instruction for their students. And at this time, I'm sure all of you shared these concerns that we saw in the media and among schools and communities about whether students would have access to technology and internet to adequately participate in distance learning. Now, for the schools in this survey, although there was a lot of variation in where students started in terms of their access at the point of building closure, by May 1st, a majority of schools were reporting that a large proportion of their students had access. So to explain this graph in further detail, the individual points that you see here represent a single school, and the x-axis shows the percentage of students within that school that had access at the point of building closure, either to technological devices on the left or to internet on the right. And the y-axis shows that the percentage of students within the same school that had access as of May 1st. And the key thing to notice here is the pooling of those points towards the top of the graph, which illustrates my point that regardless of where the proportion of students and their access started, by May 1st, very many students within many, many schools had access to both technology and internet. And this was not without efforts made by the schools. So we saw that nearly 75% reported purchasing equipment for students. Over half provided internet access to their students. And in addition to that, nearly 2/3 also reported provided printing learning materials to students, which may have served as an interim solution as they ramped up their capacities to provide technology or internet, or a solution to allow these students that never got access to continue to participate in distance learning.
Great, thanks, Charla. We know that this ramping up of technology was done to move the work of schools online. What was really interesting to us is that schools weren't simply taking what they were doing pre-closure and then moving it into a virtual space. In many cases, they're also changing the mode of instruction and the mode of learning that was happening. And you can see some of that here in this chart. Those two big blue bars on the top level there indicate that an overwhelming majority of schools were increasing the amount of self-directed or blended learning that was happening. Now, that might not seem like a shocking result to you, given that it was a move to remote instruction, but it's worth noting that schools didn't have to do this. I can imagine a more traditional, for example, middle or high school with lecture-based classes, taking those lectures, putting them into Zoom and being done with it. But it really seems that schools were not doing that. They were taking the move to remote instruction as an opportunity to modify and sort of adapt their methods, which was interesting to us. Now, that pivot put pressure, obviously, on every member of the school community. Here we asked about challenges faced specifically by teachers. And we won't go through all of these, but a couple stood out to us. One is navigating technology. Navigating technology was not heavily reported as a source of problems, so that was a good thing. But it sort of indicates just generally that the technology piece seems to have gone more smoothly than maybe first anticipated. The kind of, I would call them sort of the tactical classroom pieces, keeping students' attention, knowing that they're on task, those things proved more challenging. And I'm sure if there are teachers on this call, they may be nodding their heads as they hear that. All right, so keeping in mind the challenges faced by teachers, we did specifically ask about how teachers were spending their time. Big uptick here, and this came from actually multiple questions in the survey, big uptick in time spent communicating with families. So reaching out to parents and guardians. Again, maybe that's to be expected. Unexpected to us is that about half of the schools said that there were not changes in the amount of time teachers spent lesson planning. We would have thought the move to remote instruction would have necessitated all sorts of sort of rejiggering of curriculum and lesson plans, but that turns out not to be the case. And in some cases, schools reported teachers spending less time on lesson planning, presumably dedicating those energies elsewhere. So a little bit of a surprise to us. Now that's the teacher time piece of it. Probably the most important finding from the entire survey, we would argue, is how students were spending their time. The majority of schools reported decreases in learning time, and that was true across all subjects. It's important to note here that this is not simply class time. We knew class time was going to go down. We were explicit in how the question was posed in the survey. This included time on asynchronous learning, independent projects, and so on. Students were, for most schools, spending less time on their subjects. Now, we don't know whether this decrease in learning time, how that might amount to a decrease in learning. We would hypothesize it will. We don't know the extent of that, though, until we get some outcome data, hopefully from this coming year. But this is probably the most important result from the survey that we want to track going forward. All right, I think for the sake of time, we'll skip over for now IEPs and ELL, MLL. But if there are questions on that, we can obviously circle back. Charla?
So at the same time, we know that schools also made changes to the programs and services during this period. And here is a table that shows you the programs or services we asked about in the survey. How many schools offer that they created these programs, expanded or continued them, or reduced or eliminated them during this time period. And you'll notice that cuts to non-academic programs like physical wellness or clubs and activities were reported by about 75% of the schools, which is perhaps unsurprising because this likely requires some in-person interaction to move forward. Few programs were created at this time, but the one that was most commonly reported, at least among 5 schools, was on-site childcare. And what you'll notice here is that a majority of schools reported continuing or expanding their social emotional counseling. So this may show that schools are being responsive to students' needs and the urgency that they were facing. And we have some evidence to show that later in the survey that we're not presenting here today. We also asked schools to reflect on the successes that they were experiencing with remote instruction. And in addition to the use of technology, which we alluded to earlier, schools also expressed success with employing various learning modalities during this period of distance learning, their capacities to support teachers, how well they were connecting and communicating with families, and their ability to adapt instruction and assessment to students' needs. And finally, we had asked schools as of May 1st, how they had started planning for the 2020-2021 school year. And you'll notice here that nearly all schools had at least started to discuss that plan or were developing it, which is in addition to concentrating on facilitating the remote learning at the time. Although given how things have unfolded since May 1st and Governor Cuomo's announcement that schools can reopen for in-person instruction, it's likely that these plans have changed or have gone through further iterations.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. So, knowing that a lot of planning was done back in May and June, and now the school year is upon us, and things are changing in real time as we present this even, we wanted to highlight a few things that struck us, came out of the surveys from May as considerations for the long term, considerations for the future. So there are really three things here. One is that it was really clear to us as we were going through the surveys that schools were not necessarily on the same page when it came to certain policies and practices. So for example, final grades. Some schools moved to a pass-fail system, others tweaked their grade scales, right? Others didn't issue grades, and so on. So big differences there. And then similarly, attendance. Schools had different definitions of what it meant to attend school. Was it a login per day, handed in a certain amount of work, right? A big range of options there. Now, this might be the beauty of charter schools, right? There might not be a need to sort of work in lockstep with each other, but to the extent to which coordination and at least setting sort of some standards on this are important based on what we saw from the spring, that might be an area for future work. So that was one consideration. The second had to do simply with sustainability. So it was clear from the surveys that schools were expending a tremendous amount of energy, quite impressively, but whether that was sustainable was not necessarily clear. To give an example of this, when we asked about IEP supports and making sure that accommodations were provided appropriately to students, a lot of that work, schools told us, fell on learning specialists. So we can imagine learning specialists taking on that extra work, still meeting with students, supporting teachers, pushing into classes, doing documentation, right? That's a lot. And so I think there is a kind of an open question here about whether or not come October or November, we're faced with learning specialists keeling over from exhaustion, right? And that's just one example. We can apply this across the school community to teachers and administrators and others. So long-term question about sustainability. And then lastly, it struck us that many of the practices that schools highlighted were positive practices independent of the pandemic, truthfully. So to give a couple of examples, schools cited, they mentioned in large numbers that working one-on-one with students and doing one-on-one check-ins was really valuable. When students weren't engaged in their schoolwork or attending regularly, reaching out to extended networks of family and friends proved really effective. Now, those might have been part of school protocols prior to building closure, but if not, they seem like good practices for the future, right? Even when in-person instruction resumes. So what are the lessons from the spring that could be gathered by way of for school improvement for the future? So that was our third kind of consideration. And with that, I'll sort of hold off, and there might very well be questions on what we presented, and we're happy to field this.
Yomika, I think at this point we're going to turn it over to the state's authorizers. So I don't mean to jump in front of you. Maybe if you're on mute. I will turn it over to the state's authorizers.
Technical difficulties here, yes, sorry. Thank you for that. No problem. Thanks, Anna, for jumping in. And with that, I'm just going to turn it right back to you. Thank you, folks. We'll turn it to the Q&A.
Before we go to Q&A, I think Jeff from the SUNY Charter Schools Institute, David from SED, and Aaron from DOE would love to hear any sort of thoughts, reflections, takeaways, highlights and in particular, look aheads, right? I think, you know, we're going to be doing some version of this for the foreseeable future. And I think, you know, the folks at CREDO synthesizing it in this way has been hugely helpful, and would love to hear from you all as authorizers. If you were a school leader in particular hearing this, what would you highlight? And as authorizers, what did you take away from this?
Well, if my colleagues don't mind, I'll jump in here. I mean, I think looking over the rest of the results and hearing Dan and Charlotte's comments today, what stands out to me is the explicit focus on what students and families need, that schools really stepped up to face the opportunities, you know, in light of all the challenges. I mean, so much of the local headlines and the national headlines are doom and gloom about what is not possible, you know, what possibly can't happen in the upcoming school year. And I think that this evidence really, you know, stands up to that assertion and sort of defies that assertion. I mean, there were a couple of particular cases. You know, Dan mentioned the urgency very early in the slide, and I mean, we certainly saw that focus on meeting students' needs. There were a couple of particular cases that I took out of the long form answers that I think these were specific to, you know, these came from the data set from SUNY schools, but I'm sure that there were others just like these in the rest of the data set, that schools found new and more consistent communication with families and formed closer ties. I mean, we heard a little bit of that in Dan and Darla's comments. Also, as Dan pointed out, you know, schools didn't just transition the model from in-person to Zoom, that schools really worked hard to find new ways to incorporate instructional technology that made lessons smarter and more engaging. And we saw evidence in these results that, you know, leveraging all of these new opportunities in terms of scheduling and logistics for teacher planning time and coaching and office hours also lent some benefit to the response in terms of serving students and families. And SUNY is in the process of looking at plans for next year, and those are coming in. We've been able to scan a couple of them and get a little bit of a forecast of what schools are planning for this upcoming year. And really, we're seeing evidence of the same, that there's really a clear commitment to serving students and leveraging these new opportunities in ways that demonstrate the flexibility and responsiveness that schools are building into these plans. So it's really inspiring to see.
I would echo Jeff's sentiments, and you know, I think we should pause, take a step back, and see what we accomplished as a charter sector. That these results in this survey really is a first in the nation look at how a system of schools that by and large are serving vulnerable students came together to address a once in a lifetime crisis, and to see that schools took an urgent situation, used their considerable autonomy, and I hope within the milieu of accountability, and adapted to change quickly. You know, the statistic that it only took you 3 days to pivot to remote instruction on average is really, I applaud you. You know, thinking back to the spring, there were some schools, you know, and I'll leave it at that, not charters, but that were doing worksheets or nothing for months. And that was not the case with the charter schools. And so and actually I take this from Mackie, because Mackie always says there's nothing, charters don't have a monopoly on accountability and autonomy. But I think that is one of the keys of our success. And we really utilize that as a sector to our advantage. And part of coming together as a team, you know, we couldn't have done this without Mackie and Dan and Charla, who, by the way, did this because they thought it was a good research project, not because they're being paid. And so, you know, I hope all of us will take a moment and thank CREDO for just their intellectual curiosity and really being friends of New York, as always. I think that we should celebrate that by and large, charter students were not subject to the digital divide, that we really made concerted efforts to close that digital divide. And like the academic learning gap, students in charter schools don't have the same issues accessing the internet or accessing technology because of that individualized attention and support that charter schools are able to provide their students. And I think that that's a key takeaway as well. However, I'm most proud of the community and parent engagement that our schools did, and it was on one of the slides. But we hope to authorize a series of community-based or community-focused charter schools, and to see that charters spent so much more of their valuable time on making sure that they were connecting with community, connecting with parents, makes me very proud as an authorizer. And I hope that will be one of the things that we take away from the pandemic, that connection with community, whether it's parents or students or your teachers or your authorizer, is key to that, to success. No pun intended. And that schools spent so much more time on the social emotional aspect of education. I really do believe it's two sides of the coin. Students need to be ready to learn, but they also need to learn. You can't have one without the other. So it was nice to see that so many schools were focused on making sure that we were addressing the severe trauma that many of our students were facing. I was speaking to Rafiq Khalidi Dean, who's the school leader of Ember Charter School, and he said there isn't a day that went by in the spring when one of his students didn't have an aunt or an uncle or a brother or a sister or a parent who passed away from COVID, and really was a traumatic time, and our schools really stepped up. Some lessons learned beyond the pandemic, as I mentioned before, the community. I think individual instruction is important. How are you differentiating the work that you do to meet the unique needs of your students? And how are you assessing results, whether that assessment is academic? And I hope all of our schools were really thoughtful about measuring academic progress of students in a difficult time, in a non-traditional setting, but also how are you measuring the social emotional growth and health of your students? And so looking ahead, what we want to make sure that we do as an authorizer is focus on that community-based authorizing through surveys, through a focus on measuring social emotional outcomes. I'm working with Janet Klein, who's our data analyst, on more robust measures of social emotional learning and school culture that we're doing as part of a grant with many of our overage undercredited schools like New Dawn and Urban Dove and New Ventures. And then how do we work with you around, in the fall in particular, around your reopening plans to provide support and connect you with resources? That's a goal of ours, and we look forward to having those conversations. So that being said, I'll turn it over to Erin for last words.
Thank you, David. David, you don't know it, but you just steadily checked through all of my talking points, so you've made my job very easy. But I want to echo what David mentioned, that we found it really refreshing and amazing to see how much additional communication has been happening with families and communities. And as a parent myself, I've really enjoyed that additional contact from my son's school. So we think not only this year, as we're definitely facing some remote learning, but also as we move back, hopefully in the near future, to really more sustainable in-person learning, how can we keep up that communication? Because I know that families are really finding it to be very valuable. The other thing that we noted was that even through remote learning, even as the schools had to quickly pivot, schools were really keeping expectations high. And so we knew that anecdotally. We knew a lot of this anecdotally from talking to schools, but it's been so helpful to see the complete picture for our schools of what you were feeling and what you were experiencing, so that as we're going into your remote learning or for your reopening plans for this year, we know what we're looking for, what you were experiencing last year, and how we can kind of help bridge those gaps that you may have felt. So not a whole bunch more to add beyond what the other folks have shared, but we just want to say that we really appreciate everyone who took the survey. And we really look forward to working with you next year. Well, thanks, Erin, because I actually have a couple of questions and there's some in the Q&A that I'll turn to. But to build off what Erin's saying, to the CREDO team generally, I would love to know, looking ahead to next year, knowing that this isn't stopping, are there data points that you think either at the state level, as authorizers, as the state association, as CREDO, or that schools should be prepared to be tracking or collecting either newly, continually, or in a different way than potentially they have been doing up to this point?
Mackie, do you want to say something about outcome data? I suspect you do.
Well, hi, everyone. I really wasn't planning to say very much today, so I'll only make this one point and then I'll go back to being quiet, which is unusual for me. The big thing that we know about last year is that we lost the ability to measure what kids knew at the end of the year. And given the vast differences across schools and across kids in terms of the lived experience that they had, they're coming back to school with very, very different starting points. And so for me, when I think about all of the incredible focus and energy and devotion that the charter schools in New York State have put forth in service to their students, one of the most important ways that they can support students is to be very clear about where those kids are when they come back to you. And I know that that involves a challenging set of circumstances to do any kind of rigorous measuring, but I really want to stress that the best way that we can help the students and understand what they're going to need and how much they're going to need in order to get back on track is to be very baldly curious about what they actually do know. So with that, I think there are all kinds of other process and experiential kinds of data that we are interested in exploring with you over the coming year. But the biggest piece for us is trying to figure out a way to get a stake in the sand about where the kids are when they come back.
That's, I couldn't agree more personally. And hopefully David, Susie, and Erin won't mind if I put them on the spot. And Jeff, I only say Susie because I actually had an email chain about exactly this. But Jeff, please weigh in because I think authorizers, I know I speak for schools when they say like, what would you recommend, right? And is there a way that the charter sector can take the lead as a sector in the state on capturing any sort of return to school baseline data in a way that isn't school by school or anecdotal? Is there an opportunity here, even if it is, opt-in from schools to say, here are the 2 to 3 best possible ways in a fractured time to establish some sort of consistent baseline? Because my personal crystal ball, so no one think I'm speaking on behalf of the Board of Regents here, my personal crystal ball says it's going to be an uphill battle to have meaningful state assessment data for the 2021 school year. That's my personal crystal ball. So in that context, if you were a school trying to establish a baseline data in the fall where you could meaningfully reassess in the spring in a year that is going to be bananagrams, that's the official term, what would you recommend? And would love, Mackie and the CREDO team, if you have thoughts and reflections based on your national perspective as well, to hear.
Well, since I was personally invited, I'll weigh in here. I don't know that I have, and I'm also going to give you a perfectly rounded out non-answer. I don't know that I have a method to get to the answer to your question. Like, what's the way to get that measure of baseline? I'm not sure. But let me talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is accountability. Because in addition to what Mackie talked about in terms of measuring students where they are when they come through the door, so that teaching and learning can be responsive to that. There is an issue about not, even if we have state exams that are administered towards the end of the year, that'll be great. But what are those measures actually going to tell us from kid to kid, from school to school, given all of the turmoil that students have gone through? So, the year over year consistency of those measures is going to be tough to determine. So I think that getting a good baseline measure and establishing that when kids come in the door is a really, really important is an important topic. It's an important thing for schools to pay attention to, both in terms of the academic program and also in terms of accountability, because we may not have those consistent, reliable measures that we used to rely on.
I would agree with Jeff. It's, I don't think we're in a position to mandate an interim assessment like many other states do. There are laws in place that would probably prohibit us from having schools expend funds towards that. However, we, as part of schools' reopening plans, part of the conversations that we plan to have are, how do you get that baseline data, whether you're using MAP or ANET or Fontes and Pinel, which I know is difficult to administer remotely, but or something in between or something else. The worst thing we think a school can do is to not provide data for your teachers, for your administrative staff, for your board, also for your parents, on how your students are doing academically. I've spoken to so many schools about this, and the seriousness by which schools take getting feedback to parents about their academic progress of their students is so important, that parents really entrusted you as schools with shepherding their babies through the spring and now through the fall. It's definitely something we want our schools to think about. We also, unfortunately, we don't have district comparative data here, and one of these days we will. However, today we don't, and so I think it's important that schools use this data that we have for the charter sector to benchmark yourselves against. That as a charter school, are you lagging in one of these indicators? If so, why? And be thoughtful about that. There's also, I would encourage schools to be more mindful about comparisons to social emotional measures. The New York City DOE, for example, has a great school culture survey that they put out every year. How is your school faring on that? Now's the time, I think, for us to expand our definition of what accountability means, and say SUNY is a thought leader in that. I forget, maybe 3-4 years ago, they started the Active Ingredients Project, and we need those type of projects now more than ever.
So I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to challenge David on something. I can do that. I can lob something from California because I'm at a safe remove. What would the state's response be if, as a sector, the charters of New York State stood up and said, you know what, we want the spring 20 assessment now in the fall. We want it for our kids need it, they deserve it. Do you think that there would be, so the reasons that it was canceled are completely understandable and legitimate, but now you had the assessment and you're not using it. Is there any chance that that could be the baseline for this year?
I think luckily Mackie's in California, but I think the best course of action is, if the sector as a whole think it's important to have a baseline assessment, the sector as a whole should come together and create a baseline assessment that they can use as a sector. I think we only can control what we can control. So we can't impose that on district or non-public or other types of schools, but you can come together and say, hey, as a sector, we think the MAP assessment or ANET or whatever you want to use is something that we want to do as a team and then report out on it. I will definitely bring back Mackie's suggestion to our colleagues in the Office of Accountability and the Office of Assessment here at SED. It's definitely an interesting one, and I'm sure they will receive it with the enthusiasm that I do.
Well, don't let them go to waste, right? Like somewhere in an OGS warehouse, there are piles and piles and piles of those tests. And if nothing else, I feel like we should have a TikTok video of David and Susie and Aaron and, right, like going through and TikTok was created for nothing if not that video. But Matthew, I think that's a great suggestion, and I would just reiterate, you know, our willingness to help with the authorizers if there are a small set of assessments that would be recommended to get any sort of a statewide, sector-wide baseline, so that charters can lead on this, and so that if there is not a spring assessment and those assessments offer the opportunity for growth assessments within the year, that it's something that charters are taking on themselves to do.
So if I can pick up on something else that David said, David, not to pick on here, but you know, there was a time, we don't do it anymore, and I'm not suggesting that we would do it this coming year, but there was a time when SUNY required, as part of the charter contract, that schools administer a nationally normed standardized test. So that has been a strategy that SUNY's used in the past, and you know, there is an opportunity here if the last year's state exams don't happen to be available. There is an opportunity here for another road that the sector could possibly lead on, and you know, we'd be happy to support. You know, to support the association, and Anna, thanks for the offer, but we'd be happy to work together and figure out a path, you know, what that path might look like as well in terms of getting the sector together and coalesced around a strategy here and moving that ball forward.
No offense taken, Jeff. I will just add, you know, I think that is not a bad idea. I would also encourage us to think about how we can look at, to steal some language from the active ingredients project, but to look at some of those leading indicators of academic success as well, as we are thinking about our own authorizing practices. And we spoke a lot about what we want our schools to take away from the pandemic. I think there's a lot that we as authorizers should be taking away from the pandemic as well. The importance of looking at some of these previously thought intangible indicators that we've now figured out, in part through programs like Active Ingredients, are really important, and really tell a pretty an important story. However, you know, they are more difficult to measure. But I think that we're all pretty smart people, and if we put our minds to it, as we've been doing for the past few years, we can really come up with a more robust performance idea of what performance looks like, and make sure that New York is a thought leader in moving past just standardized assessments. Although by no means would I think standardized assessments are not important. I think they're extremely important, and I will continue to believe they're important.
All right, so building off the question, David, that was in the Q&A that you answered, you know, sort of a little bit in one of your comments about not having district comparison data for the state of New York. And I think CREDO did an admirable job of referencing, to the extent possible, reliable national data where it's been pretty spotty, quite frankly. But I'd be curious if there are other states or organizations, and maybe this question is particular for the CREDO team, that that you're aware of that are collecting this sort of data, and if they weren't before, that they are looking to do now. Are there ways that that this report and the charter sector's leadership in New York could also be a spur to action, in particular, knowing that the school year is really just on the cusp of starting in other places. Do you all know of other places that are trying to collect rigorous, sort of consistent, non-anecdotal data?
So over this past summer, we partnered with 20 states who recognized that the loss of their assessment data was going to be really critical. And one of the things that we did for them, which we were pretty pleased with, was we actually simulated what the spring 20 assessment scores would look like for kids, and then discounted how much learning loss there would have been because of COVID. And so our partners are working with those data right now to try to figure out sort of what predictive value does that have, helping schools understand where those kids are coming back, you know, and the comments that we've gotten back from our partners to date are much more about trying to figure out whether there are ancillary data collections that would help teachers and education leaders. And so some of it is around that active ingredients conversation that David has alluded to, that Susie and her team have developed. But part of it is just asking families for input about what kinds of supports, what kind of respite the parents need, what kinds of collaboration across families they'd be open to considering, you know. So I think the focus is still very much more on the coping strategies right now, but they're also looking at these data to say, what does this tell us about what we need to help our educators understand they're going to need to do to get kids back on track?
Absolutely, that really resonates as someone who was on a Zoom call earlier while helping her charter school students try, probably unsuccessfully, to wrap up their summer work, and achieving a level of resistance as yet unseen since March, and me saying, like, school starts again in just a couple of weeks, like like, oh my geez, like I don't know what we're gonna do, and we are doing our best, and I am so grateful for our kids' school, but it has definitely been an unprecedented time. So I would love, if there are folks who have questions to add to the Q&A, please Q&A now or forever hold your peace, because I will otherwise pose sort of one last wrap-up question for anyone who wants to contribute, and say, if you're a school or a school stakeholder listening to this right now, and you were to take away one thing in order to go into the next school year and make that as good as it could possibly be, given all of the contingencies and limitations that we know are likely to come to pass, what would be that one takeaway or recommendation based on what you saw in the data here, or what you're seeing potentially, CREDO team, in data and conversations that you're having in other places around the country?
Anna, for me, it was, you already highlighted it, it's that communication piece. We saw that consistently through all the survey results. That was the sort of the bedrock of school success in the spring. So I would say that communication piece should be kept up as much as possible. And as a parent, I'm feeling it. I'm in the same vibe you are, Anna, on that.
One of the things that was very striking to me in the data that we didn't actually dwell on today was that schools just didn't put a solution in place and stick with it, that they actually iterated on that in a really meaningful way. And the majority of schools did that. And when I think about the kind of demonstration that you might want to show that the charter sector is in fact focused correctly and is structured correctly, that's the place I look. That you're not taking solution one as the final solution, that you're tinkering and you're iterating and you're correcting, and in some cases replacing. And so I know how much extra work that represents, but what that says is you're focused on your student success, and if you see things need to change, you're going to go change them. That's something the charter sector can claim as its own.
I can go. Sorry, my daughter is having a wonderful tantrum in the background. I think one thing that I would take away as I'm looking through the New York City results in particular is that it seems like so many charters had a very similar experience. They switched to very similar things. We're prioritizing different things and making similar decisions, even if the outcomes look different. So I would say if you're not already leveraging your networks, you already don't have a couple of partners you can call and run some scenarios by, or maybe you try something, I try something else. I would say that that might be something to bring into this next year, since it does seem like so many people are grappling with exactly the same problem.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in there, Erin, and say that one of the challenges that we've been noodling on at the association is how to make some of these recurring forums interactive to that degree, because we realize that, you know, up to this point, and in particular over the summer, it's been a lot of theory and not a lot of practice, right, in terms of these pages of guidelines and documents that you're creating and things like that. But there's going to come a point in, you know, later in this month or in September or in the beginning of October where you're going to have some of these contingencies actually play out. And they're probably not going to play out exactly the way that you thought or you hoped. And so how are we as a statewide sector stronger for the ability to say in a safe place of colleagues, like, you know, we thought we were going to do it this way and it didn't go as planned. What is someone else doing in this context? And so certainly, you know, I say to all of you panelists, but also all of you listeners, if you have thoughts or suggestions about ways to create that sort of a space or a forum, you know, we're all ears, because I couldn't agree more, Erin. I think that I couldn't tell you who said this, but no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? Something like that. And I think here the enemy is COVID. And that means that for all of the planning that folks have been doing this summer, something's going to happen in the next 6 months. It is the nature of schools. And so, you know, we charter people in this state are each other's best resources. And so anything we can do to be helpful to create that forum, we would love to do it. Other thoughts though, folks, takeaways, look aheads next year?
I have to put in another plug for that credible baseline data. I think it's so important this year and in the coming years to really figure out when kids show up, let's get a good solid measure of where they are so that we can know how far we're moving the needle and make strong plans for this year and the out years.
All right, with that, I think we're going to call it a wrap. I'm going to kind of pause one more time and give anyone a chance to put their hands up and say, nope, I do have some parting words. Okay, well then thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us, for the valuable work you did on the surveys. Thank you for schools participating today. Check out our education forum on Monday, and stay tuned on more work to come and more information to come following up. Thank you. See you Tuesday.
Thank you.